I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 11, Built with Stone and God. We last left off with the story of Constantine the Great's early career that led up to him reuniting the fractured Roman Empire and making the momentous decision to ordain Byzantium as the new capital. As we have discussed, Constantine's decision was based on many factors, but the two main points to keep in mind are that he wanted to create an empire that was held together by a shared religion, that religion being Christianity, and that the new capital would have to be located in the east, as that was where the intellectual and economic heart of the empire lay. While Byzantium did have ancient roots, on the surface it was a relatively new city. It had only been 100 years since Septimius Severus had besieged the city for 2 years, and then destroyed it in retribution for its stubborn insolence. At the urging of his son Caracalla, he then rebuilt Byzantium, but not as it had been before. This time, it was planned in the Roman style, and so while it was an eastern city by tradition and location, it was more Roman than its neighbors. When Constantine arrived at his new capital, he had a lot of work ahead of him. Byzantium was not a large or very splendid city. In fact, it appeared very meek compared to the glory of an empire that ruled over almost all of Europe, as well as parts of Asia and Africa. To his credit, Constantine was an inspired ruler who committed his boundless energy to any task despite any glaring obstacles. The task he would spend the next 30 plus years of his reign on would be one of recreating the empire in his image, and he would start in Byzantium. We will divide his efforts into two sections, as Constantine had two different types of projects in mind. In order to build a new, cohesive, and impressive empire, he needed to build both with stone and God. Before we get started on specific important buildings that Constantine commissioned, there are a few things I want to take note of. One is that in order to make the new center of Roman life reflect the diversity of the entire empire, many statues, pillars, and other miscellaneous decorations were, let's say, requisitioned from already magnificent cities. This plundering of the empire's treasures was largely due to the constraints of time and material, making the prospect of creating new wonders unfeasible. It had the added benefit of allowing Constantine to remove pagan statues from their consecrated sites and put them on display in Byzantium, in order to decorate his city while simultaneously chipping away at pagan tradition within the empire. Another point that should be stressed relates to what I mentioned about constraints on time and material. Constantine was a grand dreamer and an energetic planner, but he was not infinitely patient. He wanted his new city, and he wanted it within his lifetime, and so a massive amount of workers and building materials streamed into Byzantium to build as many buildings as possible, as fast as possible. That isn't to say that these were shoddy jobs in the aesthetic sense. You can't make a great capital with ugly buildings. But the structural stability of some of Constantine's new projects left much to be desired. They were built to inspire awe and reverence for the empire, but they were not built to last. Luckily, Constantine's successors would be able to continue his work, and many great monuments that could have collapsed lasted a long time after their expiration date, with the help of refurbishments. Now I want to go through some of the highlights of Constantine's great building campaign, starting with the center of the world. I have already postulated that Byzantium could be considered the center of the world as it was situated at a very distinct point where Europe meets Asia, like Adam reaching out to God. It was also a major connection point between the south and the north as it sat next to the strait that divided the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. But where was the exact center point of the world? Where was the spot where someone could walk to it and say, "I stand where all lines, all cultures, all peoples meet"? According to Constantine, that spot was where Septimius had built the marker in the image of the Millennium Aureum in Rome, which came to be known as the Million, or first milestone. The Million was a square structure with each side being an arch about 14.5 meters wide. These arches held up an ornate dome upon which there were 3 distinguished decorations. 2 were statues, one for Constantine and one for his beloved mother Helena. The third was the most important artifact in the world, the holiest of relics, a piece of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. Now, I'm sure, according to Jesus' teachings, that he would have accepted Constantine as a child of God despite his sins, but it is a little ironic that the instrument of his execution was so revered by the imperial institution that had signed his death warrant. Apart from the visual beauty of the Million, it also served a practical purpose as the 0 point of the empire. Its base was inscribed with all the distances to the major cities of the empire. This combination of utility and religion is a perfect example of what Constantine envisioned for his entire realm. He sought to build an efficient and uniform society that was held together by a shared belief in one true God. We will see later in this episode how that was easier said than done. Moving east from the Million, Constantine erected the first of many great churches in his new capital. It was built on top of where there had once been a shrine to the pagan goddess Aphrodite. It was officially not named after a person, but rather dedicated to the Holy Peace of God. So it was known as Hagia Irene, or Holy Peace, and it remains the oldest church in the city and the only one of the greats to not be converted into a mosque following the Ottoman conquest of the city. It is not, however, the original structure, as it was burned down in 532, and then rebuilt, but then damaged again in 740 by an earthquake, and then once again it was restored, this time with the iconic Byzantine mosaics and frescoes. Hagia Irene would soon be accompanied by two sister churches, each representing a piece of God's attributes. Constantine laid the foundations for the much smaller and lesser known Hagia Dynamis, or Holy Power, as well as the church that would eventually eclipse Hagia Irene and become the most grand church in the world, the famous Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. The original edifice of Hagia Sophia was built by Constantine with a wooden roof, and so by the time his son Constantius was ruler of the city, the structure had collapsed, but Constantius rebuilt the church as the new center of Christianity in Constantinople. Over the centuries, Hagia Sophia would undergo numerous renovations and additions, until Justinian I built the structure that we can still see today in 537. If you visit Hagia Sophia today, you will notice one major difference between what Justinian built and what you see. That is, of course, the iconic minarets that were built after it was converted into a mosque. I could do a whole episode on the history of the Hagia Sophia, and I probably will in the future, but for the time being we will refocus on the buildings constructed during Constantine's great remaking of the city. Now, churches and milestones are all well and good, but if there's one thing that the Romans could not live without, it is entertainment. Located just southwest of the Million was an old hippodrome, or horse track, that had been built by Septimius Severus. When Constantine expanded the city, he naturally decided that Severus's hippodrome was too small, and so he enlarged it and decorated it. Constantine's hippodrome was about 450 meters long, 130 meters wide, and could seat about 100,000 people. This is about 50,000 less people than could be accommodated by the famous Circus Maximus in Rome, but it made up for it in splendor. It was host to a plethora of statues made of stone, copper, or bronze, as well as ornate tapestries. But the main attraction of the hippodrome was not its works of art, but rather the horse races that constituted the epicenter of social life in the city. Originally, there were 4 teams that took part in the races and could be bet on. The teams were each named after a color, these being the blues, greens, whites, and reds, and the Byzantines had the brilliant idea of having each team sponsored by a political party. Some people complain today that politics have just become team sports where someone associates with a party and roots for them no matter what, without caring about any policy that the party endorses. People also complain that sports are no place for politics and should be treated as pure entertainment to escape from the worries of the day. The Byzantines laughed in the face of these complaints and completely tied politics and sports together. The result was often political differences and religious differences steadily built pressure like a volcano, until a sporting event sparked an eruption of violent rioting. In one such case, a rivalry between the blue and green teams caused the Nika riots, which destroyed many important buildings and killed around 30,000 people. So next time a city burns a few couches after their team wins the big game, realize that they are being pretty tame compared to how people treated horse racing in Constantinople. One decoration in the hippodrome deserves its own special mention, and this is the serpent column. It originated in Greece in 478 BC, over 800 years before the hippodrome was built. This column was erected in Delphi to commemorate the stunning victory the Greek coalition had won at Plataea in the Second Greco-Persian War, which we discussed back in episode 3. It stood at Delphi for 802 years as a monument to the time the Greek people had banded together to face an existential threat and succeeded. Now it stood at the center of Constantine's hippodrome, and has remained there for 1700 years. Jutting westward out of the Million was a broad thoroughfare called the Mese. Along this busy pathway, Constantine built a new forum entirely out of marble. The centerpiece of this new gathering place was a massive purple column that had been generously donated, or stolen depending on your point of view, by the city Heliopolis in Egypt. Within this centerpiece was a collection of relics that included baskets of 300-year-old bread that had reportedly fed the multitude, Noah's hatchet, and Mary Magdalene's ointment. Along with these Christian relics was also a small statue of Athena that had reportedly been saved by Aeneas after the destruction of Troy. The crowning attraction of this awe-inspiring column was a statue of Apollo, whose face had been replaced by that of Constantine. The statue held a scepter and an orb, the symbols of imperial authority, and inside the orb was another piece of the true cross. Again, this statue represents Constantine's obsession with using religious iconography, whether Christian or pagan or both, to enforce in the minds of his subjects the idea that the empire is ruled by a divinely select group of people. Throughout this section on buildings, we have seen how each new bit of architecture had both an aesthetic and practical use that went into transforming Byzantium into the new gleaming capital of the Roman Empire. However, no building represented the political shift away from Rome more than the new senatorial house. It was larger and more decadent than the old one in Rome, and served as an attraction for the old political families to abandon their ancestral homes in Italy to come join the new eastern-facing empire. Importantly, the senatorial house was built within the palace grounds, but on the periphery, just to show the senators that they were close enough for the emperor to keep an eye on them, but far enough for him to ignore them if he wished to. The last building I want to discuss is another church. Unlike Hagia Irene and Hagia Sophia, this church was dedicated to a specific person, or rather persons. The Church of the Holy Apostles was dedicated in 330 by Constantine, and was designated by him as his preferred final resting. In the later part of his life, Constantine had begun referring to himself as Is Apostolos, or equal of the apostles, and it was clear that he saw himself as a successor to Jesus' most faithful disciples, or even as their better. Unfortunately for Constantine, the church was not completed in time, as he died in 337. After it was finished by his son Constantius II, Constantine's remains were moved to a tomb within the church that was flanked on either side by sarcophagi that represented the 12 apostles. However, the church was a victim of that impatient attitude of building, and by 358 it looked like it was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of its golden dome. So Constantine's remains were removed until Justinian commissioned the builders of the modern Hagia Sophia to also rebuild the Church of the Holy Apostles, and Constantine was returned to his desired resting place. In the same year that the Church of the Holy Apostles was dedicated, Constantine decided to hold a ceremony in Hagia Irene that would officially declare the refounding of Byzantium as the capital of the Roman Empire in the name of the Holy Virgin. On May 11, 330 AD, Constantine rechristened the city as New Rome, but the name was a little too foreign for the Greek inhabitants of the city, and so it soon became Constantinople. This is where we will end this episode's section on architecture, but there will be chances in future episodes to discuss some of the great works that went into making the city the cultural and intellectual center of the world. While Constantinople was undergoing an extreme makeover, the emperor was also fixated on an even more ambitious project that reached outside the city limits. The task of Christianizing the Roman Empire was, to put it simply, Herculean. Constantine went about converting the realm much more practically and intelligently than probably any ruler in history. Up until this point, when emperors had tried to force religion on their people, usually at the expense of Christians, they had done it by cracking down on non-believers and supporting violent outbursts of iconoclasm and murder. Constantine's first ever empire-wide religious policy was the Edict of Milan, which outlawed the persecution of any religion. This set the precedent that his reign would be marked as one of toleration. But if he didn't make it illegal to not be Christian, then how could he more gently force his people to accept the word of the one true God? Well, Constantine had the enlightened idea that he would simply make it easier to be Christian and harder to be pagan or Jewish or anything else. As the highest authority and probably the richest man in the land, Constantine used his patronage to support the Christians. He built many churches throughout the empire, notably the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and Old St. Peter's Basilica on the hill that St. Peter had been martyred in Rome. He also returned any property that had been stolen during his predecessor's persecution of the Christians. His two most subtly important policies were the gradual replacement of pagan symbols with Christian ones, and the appointment of Christians to high administrative offices. These two policies were not as dramatic as building a grand church or burning heretics, but they went a long way towards the eventual supplanting of paganism with Christianity among both the upper and lower classes. As Christianity began taking firmer hold over the population, Constantine was able to institute more drastic reforms to limit paganism's ability to rival his desired religion. So between 331 and 334, Constantine issued a decree that shut down all pagan shrines within the empire. While this didn't make being a pagan illegal, it did severely limit their ability to worship and gather with other pagans. All of these changes represented a huge shift in Roman and world history, as the most powerful state in the world declared itself to be Christian. As we will see in the next episode, there would be an inevitable backlash, but for now, Constantine's dream of an empire united by a shared belief in God and under the guidance of a strong Christian emperor was well on its way to coming true. Except, this dream was built on a foundational lie. This was a lie that Constantine had fooled himself into believing. This was a lie that would eat away at the unity of the empire until it split apart for good. This lie was that Christianity itself was a united religion. If history has taught us anything, it's that the only thing that Christians hate just as much as non-believers, it's other Christians with slightly different ideas about the Word of God. This fundamental problem with the Church is something that Constantine would have to deal with throughout his reign, much to his dissatisfaction. Even a ruler as brilliant and energetic as Constantine could not reconcile the differences between church leaders, as we will now explore in this episode. The two major sects that had broken from the Universal Church and remained an obstacle to Christian unity at the beginning of Constantine's career were the Meletians in Egypt and the Donatists in North Africa. Despite the fact that these were two separate sects, they had both split from the church over the same issue. This issue arose from Diocletian's great persecution of the Christians that we mentioned last episode. During the persecution, many Christians were offered clemency if they renounced their religion. The alternative was imprisonment or more likely death. Some Christians took the less deadly option, while others believed that if Jesus Christ could die for their sins, then it was only fair that they lay down their lives in his name. After the Edict of Milan officially ended the persecution, many quote-unquote lapsed Christians returned to the faith, expecting their brothers and sisters to welcome them back with open arms. On the whole, they were welcomed back, either immediately or after undergoing penance for the sin of turning their back on God. There were, however, some who did not want these lapsed Christians, who they called traditores, to ever be allowed back into the church. The Donatists and Meletians were the two main groups of these hardliners. For years they railed against the Christians in Rome and stirred up trouble in their respective provinces, until Constantine made the monumental decision to try and intervene. This was the first time that a Roman emperor had attempted to issue a ruling on internal church affairs, but despite all his power, Constantine was unable to heal the schism. Fed up with the intractability of the two rebellious sects, in 317 the emperor established the death penalty for anyone disturbing imperial peace and confiscated Donatist property in Carthage. This more aggressive tactic also failed to get rid of the schism, so in 321 Constantine relented and asked the Catholic bishops to tolerate the Donatists as best they could. The Donatists and Meletians constituted a minor annoyance compared to the calamity that was brewing in Alexandria. The old Hellenic city was, aside from Rome and Jerusalem, probably the most important Christian city in the world at that point, though it would soon be overtaken by Constantinople. The problem in Alexandria arose from the preaching of a man named Arius, who was not a part of the formal church hierarchy and carried a dangerous message. His big idea was that Jesus was not a manifestation of God, but an instrument of his will, that the Son was a perfect man, but he was not divine. While the Donatists and Meletians' conflicts were drawn from temporal grievances, Arius was questioning the very nature of Jesus Christ and a central tenet of the Christian faith. The Archbishop of Alexandria, a man conveniently named Alexander, tried to nip this heresy in the bud by excommunicating and exiling Arius, but back in those days, theological discussion was the center of intellectual and social debate, so the Arian heresy spread rapidly. By 324, Constantine could see that the problem had broken containment and threatened to split the entire Christian world, so he made a decisive and unprecedented move to try and reconcile Arius and Alexander. He called a universal council of the church, to be held in Nicaea, a city in Asia Minor, just across the water from what was at this time still Byzantium. Now, Constantine was not a theologian. As we have already discussed, his faith was more of the practical kind, so he held no strong opinions on whether Jesus was divine or mortal. His main goal for this council was to establish the precedent that the empire could call a mass meeting of church officials, and thus became the de facto head of the Christian church. He was, however, strongly invested in making sure that the church avoided a massive schism, so he did use his authority, not as a member of the clergy, but as emperor, to try and moderate the debate. The result of said debate was the establishment of the Nicene Creed, which importantly described Jesus as consubstantial, or of one substance with God. This definition satisfied both Arians and Orthodox churchmen. In the case of Arius himself, he was condemned by the church, his teachings were marked as anathema, and he was exiled to Illyricum, although he would not stay there for long, but that is a story for another time. Moving on, Constantine wasn't the only member of the royal family that was making big moves in the Christian world. In 327, his mother Helena was 72 years old and approaching the end of her life. She had come a long way since being cast aside by Constantine's father, and was now the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire. But even the powerful must bow to time. Before she left the mortal world, Helena had one more dream to fulfill, so she traveled all the way to Jerusalem, becoming the first recorded Christian pilgrim. Her time in Jerusalem was not spent idly, and she went on a grand tour of the Holy Land, discovering many important relics and establishing many shrines and churches in her son's name. The most important relic that she discovered was one that we have already mentioned in this episode, the true cross. The story goes that Helena discerned the true cross from those of the two other men executed beside Jesus by using it to heal a sick man. She later died in Rome in 330, but her contribution to the reclamation of venerable relics meant she was canonized as the patron saint of new discoveries. The year 330 was a momentous one for the now 58-year-old Constantine, but he would not have time to grieve the loss of his beloved mother, or celebrate the dedication of his new capital, as the Roman Empire never rested and needed constant management. On the docket again was the rivalry in the church between Arius and the Archbishop of Alexandria. This time, the Archbishop was a man named Athanasius, as Alexander had died in 328. Athanasius was even more shrewd than his mentor, and utterly committed to stamping out the pro-Arian sentiment that was still pervasive. Arius enjoyed the support of a majority of Asian bishops, which in turn allowed him to stay in favor with the emperor despite his exile. Constantine, upon hearing that Arius had accepted the Nicene Creed, sent word to Athanasius that Arius should be allowed to return home. Much to the surprise of the emperor, Athanasius refused. He probably believed that Constantine's order was simply a request, and as an archbishop, he outranked Constantine in church matters. He would soon learn that excluding God himself, no one could ignore a request from the emperor. Only 5 years after the signing of the Nicene Creed, the Christian world was once again threatening to tear itself apart over doctrinal issues and personal rivalries. So as Constantine prepared to celebrate his 30th year as emperor, he called for another great meeting of the clergy, this time in Jerusalem. Consequently, he told the church officials to meet in Tyre before coming to Jerusalem so that they could hammer out their personal differences before deciding on church doctrine. The synod at Tyre quickly turned into a trial against Athanasius, as the delegation overwhelmingly consisted of pro-Arian bishops. Before they could convict him, Athanasius fled to Constantinople, where he hoped to take refuge with the emperor. To his dismay, Constantine had already made up his mind about the Alexandrian archbishop, and instead of receiving him, exiled him to the faraway city of Trier. Constantine held the ill-conceived belief that by removing one of the leaders of the conflicting factions that he could heal the rift within the church. First he had exiled Arius, but the Arians kept the fight going. Now he had removed Athanasius, and hoped that Arius could peacefully return to Alexandria. But the issues between the pro- and anti-Arians were more widespread than a single man, and every attempt Arius made to re-enter the city caused massive riots. And so Arius was forced to return to Constantinople, where he was summoned by the emperor to again plead his case so that Constantine could decide what to do with him. It was during this relitigation that, according to multiple sources, but most gleefully from Athanasius, that Arius had a sudden bout of indigestion, so tremendous that his stomach burst and he died. Even the death of Arius could not end the bickering of factions within the church, but Constantine would not have to worry about this eternal headache for much longer. By the year 337, Constantine was 65 years old, and the 31 years he spent ruling the largest contiguous territory in the world had taken its toll. His spirit remained bright and energetic, as showcased by his military maneuvers in Persia during the early months of 337. However, his body could no longer withstand the monumental workload he willingly took on. He returned to Constantinople before Easter to oversee the finishing touches on the Church of the Holy Apostles, and celebrated the holiest day on the Christian calendar in the great city he had lifted to the heavens. After Easter, he began feeling the weight of his years, and so he took a relatively short trip to the bathhouses in Helenopolis, less than 60 miles from Constantinople. Perhaps Constantine saw the writing on the wall, because it was here that he began the steps to be officially accepted into the Christian Church. He still wanted to wait to be baptized in the city that bore his name, so he began making the return journey. He went by way of Nicomedia, and upon reaching the spot where he had made history by defeating his rival Licinius and become the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, he found that he could go no further. So it is here, rather than Constantinople, that he was finally baptized. It seems rather fitting that Constantine would be reborn into the Christian faith in the same place that he was reborn as emperor of a united Rome. I think a guy named Mark Twain said something about history rhyming. Soon after, Constantine the Great died on Pentecost Sunday, and his body was returned to Constantinople. He laid in state for 3.5 months. This long duration was not due to Constantine's last will and testament, but rather to the uncertain state he had left his succession in. The emperor had raised 5 of his sons to the rank of Caesar during his reign, and at the time of his death, 3 of these remained. Of these 3, Constantius II was in the best position, as he was located in the east. He quickly made his way to Constantinople, and oversaw his father's extravagant funeral proceedings, including a golden coffin for the emperor and a full military procession. We will end this episode as Constantine is laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Constantine left this world having accomplished more than perhaps any other emperor in Roman history. As this is a podcast more or less focused on the history of a single city, we did not touch on all the deeds and accomplishments of his monumental reign. We did, however, go over the truly transformative building campaign that set Byzantium and then Constantinople on the path to becoming the most splendid city in the world. I also included a section on Constantine's dealings with the Christian Church, as I believe it is not only an important part of his legacy, but will be fundamentally linked to the identity that Constantinople will embody during the rest of the narrative. At the time of Constantine's death, not all of Constantinople, or the Roman Empire in general, was Christianized, but as we will see under the rule of Julian the Apostate, the tide could not be reversed. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.